Good afternoon and welcome to all of you arriving from many different places. My name is Holly Taylor Kuhlman. I'm coming to you from the East Coast of the United States, so it's a good afternoon from here, but please do translate that greeting into your own time zone. I'll just say briefly that we have almost 180 registrants from locations literally all around the globe, waiting to see not quite that many in attendance at the moment. But I want to say a hearty welcome both from myself and also on behalf of other members of the steering committee of the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. You have arrived at the Society's annual virtual mid-year meeting. We're happy to have you. And we also want to invite you to join us as well at our annual in-person meeting, which takes place as an additional meeting at the American Academy of Religion. We have a tradition of meeting on Friday afternoon, early on Friday afternoon. And so please do take a look at those details. We would love to have an opportunity to shake your hand and meet you in person. The focus of the meeting for this afternoon is a discussion of recent monograph from Paul Griffiths entitled Israel, a Christian Grammar. That book was published in 2023 by Fortress Press. I want to begin by letting you know that Paul Griffiths is not present with us for this event. The Society did send an invitation to him, and he indicated his preference not to be a part of the event, but he sent us his well wishes. And so we will go ahead enjoying the fruit of his labor in his absence. What I'd like to do to start, I must say, I have moderated a number of webinars now, and this may be my favorite way to start a webinar because apparently it is now my responsibility to begin by announcing winners of the Fortress Press book giveaway. We have 5 individuals that are now entitled to a free copy of Griffith's book, Israel, and another 5 names who are entitled to a copy of a recent publication from one of our panelists, Kendall Soulen. The title of that work is Irrevocable, the Name of God and the Unity of the Christian Bible. So without a drum roll, I'll just go ahead and give you those names. What I want to do is to request that if you hear your name, you would email us so that we can get a mailing address to send out your prize. That address is post-supersessionism@gmail.com. No capitalization, no punctuation. Post-supersessionism@gmail.com. With that, the winners of the copies of Griffith's Israel book are Therese Gottstein, Sylvia Proles, David Orenstein, Ken Wilson, and Jason Moraff. And winners of Soulen's Irrevocable are Lizelle Bota, Ryan Lambert, Andre Villeneuve, Pierre-André Maudoui, OP, and Jordan Blanchard. So please do be in touch. And if you have any questions about that, if we need to circle back around and make sure that we've made contact with everybody, that will all be possible after the webinar has ended. All right, let me move on then to the main focus of our gathering. The format for our meeting today will focus on the contributions that we have from 4 outstanding panelists. We have a remarkable group of panelists today to offer their thoughts. What I'd like to do is to, in just a moment, give you a brief introduction to those individuals. Then, in the same order that I've introduced them, I'm going to ask each panelist to take a few moments. Those won't be long presentations, 10 minutes roughly, I'll give an opportunity for our panelists to respond to one another, see what questions, comments, or clarifications they may have. And then we will open up the questions to any participants. If you will type those in, you'll see a Q&A function that will allow you to do that. We will take the questions that we are able to take. As I said, we have a large number of participants. It's unlikely that we will be able to respond to every question, but we will get to as many as we can. All right, with that, let me go ahead and give you some quick introductions. I'll begin with Mark Kinzer, who is President Emeritus of Messianic Jewish Theological Institute and is the founding moderator of Yachad B'Yeshua, a global ecumenical fellowship of Jewish believers in Jesus. He is the author of Post-Missionary Messianic Judaism, published in 2005, Searching Her Own Mystery, 2015, and Jerusalem Crucified, Jerusalem Risen, published in 2018. He is also one of the founding board members of this society. Secondly, we will hear from Father David Neuhaus, who is an Israeli Jesuit working in both Israel and Palestine, and also in South Africa. He teaches scripture in various institutions and writes on scripture, Jewish-Christian dialogue, and current affairs. He is Emeritus Roman Catholic Episcopal Vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics, migrants, and asylum seekers in Israel. Third, Daniel Weiss is Polanski Coexists Senior Lecturer in Jewish Studies in the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. He is author of Paradox and the Prophets, Hermann Cohen and the Indirect Communication of Religion, 2012, and Modern Jewish Philosophy and the Politics of Divine Violence, published just last year. Among many other publications, he is co-editor of multiple books, including Scripture and Violence, 2020, and Interpreting Interreligious Relations with Wittgenstein in 2019. Actively involved in the Cambridge Interfaith Program, he is a recent recipient of a Humboldt Research Fellowship for experienced researchers. And then, last but not least, Kendall Soulen, who is also a member of our Society's steering committee, is professor of systematic theology at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. He is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. He is author of a number of important monographs, the most recent of which is Irrevocable, the Name of God and the Unity of the Christian Bible, as I mentioned earlier. So with that, what I'd like to do is to cede the floor, or whatever the virtual equivalent is of the floor, to Mark Kinzer to go ahead and start us off. Mark?
Thank you, Holly. Israel, a Christian Grammar is intended as a provocation, a stimulus to fruitful new ways of thinking, talking, and writing about the church and the Jewish people. Paul Griffiths undertakes this task because he is a Catholic theologian sensitive to recent dramatic developments in magisterial teaching concerning the Jewish people. Griffiths recognizes that these developments challenge conventional ways of thinking about the church's identity as the people of God. Griffiths here attempts to reconfigure the church's self-understanding in a way that is faithful both to tradition and to post-Shoah church teaching. Griffiths' grammar involves several novel lexical prescriptions. Here, Israel refers to both the Jewish people and the church. The term for the Jewish people and its form of life is the synagogue, and Gentiles are those who are neither Jews nor Christians. Thus, the term Gentile Christian is an oxymoron for Griffiths, or in his terms, a solecism, a grammatical error. This theological lexicon has its pluses and minuses, but it also advances Griffiths' provocative purpose by unsettling old categories and opening fresh conceptual options. My remarks will not focus on Griffiths' lexicon, but instead attend to a striking feature of his proposed theological syntax. This component of his grammar does what David Novak has said cannot be done. It is faithful to Christian teaching about the divinity of Jesus and Catholic teaching about the church, without falling into what Novak calls soft supersessionism. To review, in a past session of this theological society, David Novak argued that soft supersessionism is a necessary property of authentic Christian or Jewish thinking. Christians and Jews disagree on certain fundamental matters of doctrine. Quoting Novak, "It is important to recognize that these matters are not the kind of differences on which it can be said, you have your truth and we have ours. They concern our relationship to God. Here, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is the starkest. It is a matter of either or. That is, either the Jewish people or the Christian church is the fullest, most complete location for that ultimate relationship." End of quote. Novak's concept of soft supersessionism has been adopted by influential Catholic thinkers such as Matthew Levering and Gavin DaCosta. In the panel discussion devoted to the topic, it was criticized by Kendall Soulen and Nick Scott Blakely, largely on practical terminological grounds, as a weakening of the beneficial rhetorical force of the S word. But Novak's underlying theological contention was, for the most part, unaddressed. In contrast, Paul Griffiths' grammar defies Novak's logic. Griffiths unequivocally affirms Orthodox Christology, along with its Trinitarian presuppositions. He also acknowledges Jesus as Israel's Messiah. Nevertheless, one cannot reasonably interpret his grammar as a form of soft supersessionism. Griffiths' rejection of soft supersessionism is most starkly evident in the literal center of Israel, a Christian Grammar, chapter 5 in a book of 11 chapters. Entitled Israel's Propinquities, this chapter is also the longest in the book. On its first page, Griffiths cites the following saying from Anselm: "Our Christian faith is closer to the God than your Jewish faith." End of quote. Griffiths construes Anselm's statement as, in effect, a soft supersessionist credo. To quote again Griffiths, "Both synagogue and church," Anselm may be read to say, "have some propinquity to the God, but the church has more of it than does the synagogue." The propinquity, or proximity in view, here is characterized by Griffiths as a divine embrace of elected intimacy, given unconditionally and opaquely to some rather than others. He further specifies that such relational intimacy is equivalent to holiness. Quote, "The degree of anyone's propinquity to the God is their degree of holiness." Thus, Anselm is understood to assert that the church is holier than the synagogue, though the synagogue might also be holy in some sense. Griffiths proceeds to explicate the Christological claims that undergird this soft supersessionist assertion. Quote, "Jesus is the God incarnate, the only begotten. The church is the body of the same. Christians are cleaved to Jesus' flesh by baptism." End of quote. Griffiths agrees with Anselm that such claims are intrinsic to Christian speech and writing, and that their abandonment would be the abandonment of Christian discourse. Nevertheless, he denies that saying such things logically requires Anselm's conclusion. Here is where Griffiths' provocation is most audacious. In the remainder of the chapter, he offers a sustained argument for reversing Anselm's proposition. In truth, quote, the synagogue's mode of intimacy with the God places her closer to the God than is the church, end of quote. His argument is phenomenological in character. He compares the two traditions in their modes of adding new members and their approaches to language and space, and finds in each case that the synagogue displays a more intimate proximity to the God of Israel. In adding new members to the community through biological reproduction, and in marking the male reproductive organ, the Jewish people show greater fleshly propinquity to God than the church, which adds new members through the invisible sign of baptism. In privileging the language of Israel's common archive over translations, the synagogue shows greater linguistic propinquity to God. In maintaining an enduring connection to the land promised to their ancestors, she shows greater spatial propinquity. But this hierarchy of holiness is, like other hierarchical distinctions in Catholic theology, neither a matter of human attainment nor of intrinsic merit. It is instead a matter of gift and vocation. The synagogue exists to display before the world an intensely holy form of life, whereas the church exists to make that holiness accessible to all peoples. To employ a Catholic analogy not found in Griffiths, the Jewish people could be compared to a religious order, whereas the church would be equivalent to the laity. But what of the person and work of Jesus? Griffiths affirms that to the extent that Jews deny that he is the Messiah and the Son of God, they are mistaken. But he also affirms that as the second person of the Trinity, Jesus is present amidst the Jewish people. Moreover, the church is undoubtedly ignorant of much that is only knowable through the synagogue's liturgical, halachic, and theological form of life. Neither community possesses a monopoly on the truth of God. As a provocation to fruitful new ways of thinking, talking, and writing about the church and the Jewish people, Israel, a Christian Grammar, is a rousing success. Hopefully, among other things, it will stimulate further reflection on the category of soft supersessionism and challenge the assumption that supersessionism light is an essential characteristic of faithful Christian or Jewish discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to go ahead and turn to Father David Neuhaus.
Thank you very much, Holly. I presume the nature of things is that I might say some things that Mark has already said, and maybe that is good because I suppose at least some people have not read the work itself. So here goes. Undoubtedly, one of the complex contemporary issues in Catholic thought today is to enunciate a clear theology of Judaism that is in line with the fragmentary and intuitive reformulations of Catholic teaching on Jews and Judaism since the Second Vatican Council. Whereas the traditional teaching of contempt has given way to an ever-deepening teaching of respect, the theological implications for the Catholic understanding of the unicity of salvation through Jesus Christ, the Catholicity of a church made up of Jews and Gentiles, and the role of the Jewish people in salvation history after the coming of Jesus remain much debated subjects. Griffiths' book is a provocative attempt to bring Catholic theological discourse on Jews and Judaism up to date with the Church's magisterium since Vatican II. The book is phrased in a language that is unusual, to say the least. Indeed, he calls the book a grammar, but as such it stretches and reforms language so that it might say what is coherent, persuasive, and true. Relying on imaging, the author attempts to reformulate Christian teaching so that it can integrate the intuitions that developed after the Second World War into a founded theological discourse. A summary of Griffiths' basic premise is presented at the end of the book in one long sentence, and I quote, "Jews and Christians together constitute Israel. They worship the same God, they are of the same lineage, they have the same purpose. Jews are the God's particular intimates, held closer and more lovingly than Christians. The Church has seriously and systematically damaged the synagogue. For non-Jewish Christians, Jews are their closest intimates outside the Church, toward whom penitential and sacrificially loving behaviors are for the long time being the most appropriate." End of quote. For me, the four most striking points in Griffiths' book are summed up in this sentence. Number one, the people of God, Israel today, is made up of synagogue and church. This premise is strongly bound up to the post-Vatican II understanding of the fidelity of God to God's election of Israel. Paul writes in Romans, I quote, "The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." This verse is omnipresent in the Church's magisterium since Vatican II, starting from paragraph 4 of Nostra Aetate, and notably absent in centuries of teaching preceding the Council. Point number two, this synagogue is closer to God than the Church. This is strikingly phrased as, and I quote, "This synagogue is Israel's poem, while the Church is Israel's paraphrase." In one of the most striking chapters in the book, a little correction to my friend Mark, it's chapter 6, not chapter 5, still meaning it's the center, Israel's propinquities, the author goes through the elements that manifest the synagogue's intimate closeness with the God, closeness that the members of the Church from the nations can only envy. These elements include flesh and body, language and place. Point number three, Griffiths insists on taking this insight to its logical conclusion, determining that members of the synagogue should not be proselytized, as they are not strangers to Israel. Furthermore, if Jews do come to believe in Jesus, they do not need baptism as understood by the Church, for they are already joined to the flesh that is Jesus's. Even more radically, towards the end of the book, he writes that the Church, and I quote, "has no need to persuade the synagogue of Jesus here, before, and every need not to. What she, the Church, knows is Jesus, and he is a great good to know. But she is confident that she has more to learn about the God of Jesus Christ than knowing Jesus can teach her. She is confident as well that at the heart of what she has yet to learn about that God is what the synagogue already knows." End of quote. Interestingly, he comments that members of the synagogue who do become members of the Church are closest to the God. I quote, "They of all the God's intimates, the closest and the most beloved." However, he forcibly insists that a member of the synagogue who has entered the Church must be strongly encouraged to keep his or her Jewish identity. Nonetheless, Griffiths' eschatology, echoing the Church's magisterial teachings, envisions an eventual reconciliation at the heart of the Israel of God. He says, and I quote, "Israel remains at the end internally differentiated, and the surprise and delight of the Jews in finding Jesus is matched and reciprocated by the surprise and delight of the Christians in acknowledging that Jews are more capable of the God than themselves." And finally, point number 4, the deep historical consciousness regarding the Church's lack of standing that permeates the teaching of the Church after the Council is detailed throughout the book without mincing words. Members of the Church have done great damage to the synagogue and therefore have no standing to intervene in the life of the synagogue except in a penitential way. Griffiths insists that now the Church must adopt an overwhelmingly positive attitude to the synagogue that promotes its welfare always and everywhere. In reflecting on these points, I am mostly intrigued, sometimes troubled, and certainly want more. I have 4 major interrogations. Number 1, is Griffiths a fully Catholic reflection? There are aspects that make it sound like a white Eurocentric perspective. The brilliantly phrased reflections on the Church's standing, so formidably compromised by the Church's violence towards the synagogue, cannot be applied to all non-Jewish members of the Church. As the Church decenters from Europe, the language about standing with regard to the synagogue is compromised. The Church as manifest in Argentina, India, Nigeria, or the Philippines does not share the same history as their European brothers and sisters, particularly with regard to the synagogue. Point number 2. The very neat distinction between Israel, made up of synagogue and church on the one hand, and the nations on the other hand, also seems to be more problematic when the Church is not seen uniquely as its European manifestation. In the magisterium, the Church opened up, through dealing with the relationship with the synagogue, to her relationship with the myriad others outside the Church in the world she shares with them. It is significant that the Church not only discovered the grounds for a teaching of respect for Islam, the religions of Asia and Africa, etc., but also confessed the violence that had characterized the Church's engagements with the world she had set out to conquer and missionize. Does the Church have standing with Muslims or with the traditional religions of Asia, Africa, and the Americas? Point number 3, more pointedly, Griffiths clearly has an awareness of the situation in Israel-Palestine, the context in which I read his work. It is shocking for me to read, and I quote, "The Church might reasonably become an advocate for and supporter of the State of Israel with a degree of enthusiasm she shows for no other sovereign state. That would be an appropriate corrective for the Church's approach to the State of Israel since 1948, and an appropriate penance for her complicity in and occasional active support of and engagement in anti-Jewish violence during the years leading up to that foundation." End of quote. I would say that this strongly contradicts the magisterium of the Church as it stands now. In his text, Griffiths mentions the Palestinians and their reality. He recognizes that they have been, and I quote, displaced, and even more strongly worded, variously killed, dispossessed, and ghettoized. He underlines this reality toward the end of the book when he poses a question about Church support for the State of Israel, but giving no answer. I quote, During the last 3 or 4 decades, however, that sort of thing has been attenuated somewhat by a widely shared sense on the part of the European and North American intelligentsia that there is something amiss with the state of Israel's treatment of Palestinians and the question of Palestinian statehood, which can easily lead to the visceral sense that any expression of sympathy with Jews or affirmation of what they do is inseparable from hatred of Palestinians, or at least expressive of disordered political views. End of quote. I need a lot more on this in order to reflect further on Griffiths' fascinating stretching of language so that the Church might indeed say how she understands the mystery of Israel. Does the suffering church in Palestine also have no standing to speak out to the synagogue? And final point. In his description of closeness, the synagogue closer and more loved, the church more distant, I think of Martha and Mary. For centuries, Mary was seen as better than Martha because she is closer, sitting at the Lord's feet. However, Martha's busyness is essential to the well-being of Jesus. Jesus' rebuke of Martha might not be about her busyness. He says to her, "You are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken from her." The better part that Mary has chosen, I believe, is being focused on her vocation to be intimate with the God at the expense of bringing others to enjoy that intimacy. Martha's vocation, even though at a distance, is to work hard, providing for the God in his need for others to come close. Closeness is holiness, but is it better than the mission to be engaged in opening up an access in the world for others to come to the God? Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. We will turn now to Daniel Weiss.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just in terms of my comments, I'll start out with some things I found very fruitful about Paul Griffiths' book, and then move into some elements I found more questionable or could raise questions, at least for discussion. And I think both sides of that relate to questions of supersessionism, that the book is consciously seeking to engage with various aspects of supersessionism that the author finds problematic. And I think it does very interesting things in engaging and challenging with those aspects. But I'll also raise questions about whether the book may actually continue various aspects of supersessionism in key ways, or at least that would be a potential worry. So just to start with some of the more positive elements, that the author, on the one hand, I think raises a really interesting approach by saying, I'm going to consider Israel to be the synagogue and the church together, rather than in contrast or in competition for that title. So that's, I think, a very interesting approach, and that leads to various different implications. Just for instance, the author towards the end discusses the possibility of, talks about rethinking of Catholic relation to Jews like relation to Protestants or Orthodox. So it's it's a different configuration than would normally be discussed in a lot of Christian theological thinking about Jews, drawing that circle of Israel, so that there's a variety within Israel, but not doesn't require sameness for the different groups to be part of Israel. So that's an interesting notion he brings in of otherness within the concept of Israel. And in addition, the author goes through and looks at various contrasts that have previously been made historically in Christian theology about Jews or the synagogue, that had often been made in a negative way. Elements of flesh or body, or particularity of language or place, as has been discussed. And whereas in many previous forms of Christian theological discussion, the association of the synagogue with the flesh was something portrayed more negatively. And Griffiths then goes through and carefully thinks out what would it mean from a Christian theological perspective to think about those previously negatively viewed elements associated with the synagogue, to think about those more positively. So I think that's a very fruitful thought experiment in that regard, and differs from some historical approaches of Christian theology to Jews. And especially I think the key element is these are all good questions to ask. Meaning, how might Christians and or Jews think about this question of embodiment in relation to practice in different ways? And could looking at the example of associations that have been more associated with the synagogue be a useful way for Christians to potentially think about these elements of the body or particularity in new ways? So I guess it's a question we'll come back to. It's whether Jews are good to think with, and there could be pluses and minuses to that. But again, there could at least be some fruitful elements there. And I think he also is. It's very notable that he highlights the way in which the church has previously, in his phrasing, sought to run away from the synagogue. He talks about a fugal element of the fugitive running away, and he wants to say, let's have a different approach and not have a running away, and let's engage with these certain types of difference in ways that can be more productive and fruitful. That also seems like a useful project to engage in. So with some of that said, I think we can go more into detail, maybe in the further discussion of some of those specific elements. But the one thing I wanted to then transition to some questionable element is that if previously there was a tendency in Christian theology to create an essentialized difference between the church and the synagogue, and then to portray the synagogue in negative ways as a foil to the church, Griffiths challenges the negative portrayal of the synagogue, but it may be that he still retains this essentializing difference between the church and the synagogue. And it's not obvious that switching the valuation to a positive one necessarily gets away from some of the problems that come from that essentializing and generalizing, especially in attaching certain elements to the synagogue rather than the church. That if previously the trope would have been the synagogue is related to things of the body and the church is related to things of the spirit, and the connection to the body takes one away from God, the church is closer to God. And Griffiths is then saying, actually, let's look at ways in which connection to the body can be useful for thinking about closeness to God. But in that framing, he still then asserts that the synagogue is essentialized as associated with the body more so than the churches. And this comes out in various ways. And I think, again, the different people in different fields have talked about problems of essentializing that division. For instance, in contrast to saying there could be, and if you look historically, there could be various elements that have been associated in some contexts more with Jews, and maybe in some contexts less with Christians, but actually that's not the case all the time. Various aspects of embodiment and particularity, etc., have been associated also with Christians, and maybe in some contexts less with Jews. One example he gives is he talks about, for instance, elements of food and drink, and of treating food and drink as something important for relation to God. And in his portrayal, the synagogue is the group that treats food and drink as important to relation to God, whereas the church doesn't. And he says that there could be pluses and minuses to that, but there could be benefits of having a notion of material food and drink as a connection to God. So he talks about how that could be viewed positively. But that essentializing divide that Christians don't associate food and drink in relation to God. I could just say I grew up in Alabama, and in that context, definitely there was a common notion of that, especially drink being something that many Christian groups associated as one's habits about what one drinks or doesn't drink, especially alcohol, as important for relation to God. And so in that context, it wouldn't make as much sense to say, oh, that Jews have the connection to food and drink, but Christians don't. Now, what's interesting, I now live in the UK, and so in England, one is hard pressed to find as many Christians who say one shouldn't drink alcohol. That's less typical in the UK. So in that context, perhaps one might come to the idea that avoiding certain food and drink is more associated with Jews or Muslims rather than with Christians. But again, that's wouldn't be the case in all times and places. So that's just one example of the generalizing of associating certain things more with the synagogue than with the church that creates problems, I think, and in an unhelpful way. I don't think there would, maybe we can discuss more. I don't see why it would harm the overall fruitful aspects of the argument to say there may be some places, or there may be ways in which the church has associated food and drink with the synagogue and not with the church. And can we think about those in new ways? But it wouldn't require the author himself having to reinscribe or reassert those essentializing differences as though they are should be understood as a theologically normative construction. So that's one aspect. Another example could be in relation to, he brings up the elements of the particularity of land, and he associates the particular material connection to a certain land as linked to the synagogue, whereas the church is then doesn't have that connection to particular connection with land. And so in that context, he then talks about the conquest of the land in relation to the book of Joshua, and then jumps to 1948 and the foundation of the state of Israel, and as examples of a particular material connection to land that he associates with the synagogue. And it seems that it might be the case that his essentializing division of that, assuming that this is the case for the synagogue, not the church, might lead him to focus on, say, these particular historical incidents or times and points in time, but leave out, for instance, the way in which the Holy Land was related to under Constantine. There were definitely elements of interaction where the Christian control over the Holy Land in that context had a prominent theological role within Christian tradition, and or later with the Crusades. But it seems that his portrayal then Christianity, the church, doesn't have a particular connection to land, ends up casting in that essentializing division again. And one could also say that throughout, say, between the book of Joshua and 1948, actually within Jewish tradition, there may have been strong theological aspects of not treating, say, material control over a particular piece of land as something that was an actively encouraged part of Jewish tradition or theology. So again, these divisions potentially end up creating a let's say distorted or misleading binary between the church and the synagogue. And this, in my view, some of this again traces back to the trope that he continues of the very notion of working with the church and the synagogue. That very language is sort of a generalizing term. And I suppose one could have a notion of overlap between the church and the synagogue, but still, anytime when you use the term "the" in front of something, it points a bit to potential for generalizing. And the other element related to that I wanted to bring up is the aspect of which Jews or which synagogue Griffiths is talking about, because he repeatedly says, I don't really know that much about historical Jews or Judaism. I'm not basing this at all on conversations or observations of actual Jews or Judaism. This is a theological construction directed at the church for the purposes of the church. So he repeatedly says Jews may think differently about the way I construct the synagogue, and that's okay. But still, it raises questions of if he's constructing an account of the synagogue, which is not connected to actual conversations with Jews or looking at the empirical history of Jews, well, one could point to various problems that this could lead to. And again, it seems like that is in many ways maybe problematically in keeping with previous earlier centuries of Christian theology that would often construct an account of the synagogue that fit well as in relation to a certain notion of the church, in that context usually as a contrast, but wouldn't necessarily base itself on trying to make sure it was saying things that were, say, empirically accurate, trying to have conversations with Jews to say, what is your understanding of different theological issues so that I can draw upon that in shaping my account of the synagogue. Instead, it was usually done, people talk about the rhetorical Jew or the fantasy Jew. That serves a certain purpose within Christian theology, but isn't based on either talking with or even looking at in a neutral observational way of actual Jews. And I'm concerned that the synagogue and Jews in this book may be, again, go along the lines of being about fantasy Jews, even if it's in a positively intended way. That may still be a dynamic in place, which itself, again, as I may be linked to supersessionism. Some elements of supersessionism may be linked to saying Jews are no longer in connection with God, but it seems like at least another dynamic of it is linked to just this sort of essentializing, generalizing about the Jews in that way, which again is something I think that we could look at. It might be also that it's about fantasy Christians or fantasy church as well. So it may be the methodology more generally that is at play. But again, when it's a Christian theologian, someone writing about another group, especially, it's one thing if you have a fantasy account of your own tradition. That could be, there could be normative elements that you want to construct an ideal account. But especially when you're writing about another group that, as he admits, has been previously misconstrued or problematically construed by Christian theologians, then to do so on this without deliberately, explicitly not taking into account what actual Jews say or think of themselves or have done or have said over history, we potentially have a potentially significant problem remaining. So I think these are things, again, I think it's, maybe we could talk, maybe there could be value in having a constructed account. Maybe there could be pluses to that we could talk about, but at least I wanted to point out some potential downsides. And just as a final couple other points, just to bring up the way in which this approach, I think, is especially called into question. My current topic of research looks at a relation between rabbinic Judaism and the Jesus movement or Christianity in the 3rd century. So in Tannaitic literature, early rabbinic literature. And especially if we're looking at these first few centuries, there definitely, if you look historically, there was much less of a sharp divide in relation to various topics, both in terms of social grouping, but also theologically, there was less of a binary relation. And so that the development seems that it came somewhat later, maybe already beginning in this time period, but entrenched, especially from the 4th century onward, of construing Judaism and Christianity on theological issues as assuming that there's going to be a binary between them, is something that, again, maybe Griffiths' account doesn't fully address, and that, again, the example of the early period may give a different approach if we look at that historically. Finally, just on the element of, he portrays the synagogue as closer to God than the church in various ways. And I think that it's, again, you can see it as he's wanting to reverse or move away from the previous notion that was dominant in Christian theology of saying the synagogue is further from God than the church. But I think there could equally be problem. It's not clear if there's a good basis for proposing, even as a provocation, about the synagogue being closer to God than the church. And just personally, if I'm, as a Jewish person, if I hear someone say, the synagogue is further away from God than the church is, I might find that problematic. But if I hear someone say, oh, the synagogue is closer to God than the church is, I personally would also find that pretty problematic, especially if it's based on not claiming to be based on anything empirical. It's still this construction. I don't know. I don't know if Jews are closer to God than Christians are, but it's just, I don't know that it feels like it's still part of that same similar problematic discourse in that regard. And the last thing I'll say is about Islam, that I think actually there was an opportunity in the book that was missed that could have been very interesting, because I think Griffiths fruitfully construes Jews and Christians as part grouping under Israel because they both are portrayed as serving the God of Israel. And that even though they might differ in certain theological aspects, or some Jews and some Christians might differ, he places the emphasis on them both being devoted to the God of Israel. And I think it raises a question because he doesn't address Islam, but it seems like that on actually quite similar ground of argument, one could also construe Muslims as devoted to the God of Israel in the way that their the self-understanding relates to the God of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, etc. And so it's there could then be the fruitfulness of his drawing a bigger circle of including both Jews and Christians in that way may end up then by implication be problematic if on those same grounds he potentially ought to include Muslims but then doesn't. Then it could be a bit arbitrary. Now it may not be exactly the same. There could be an argument of grouping Jews and Christians together in a way different from Muslims, but at least I think it's actually the fruitful directions in Griffiths' book would point to a more you could say ought to point to a more inclusive framing in that regard, which doesn't seem to be taken up, but which he doesn't argue against that explicitly, but it could be something to discuss further.
Daniel, thank you so much. It's interesting to begin to see some commonalities emerge in our responses. Kendall Soulen, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Holly. So I want to begin by giving a shout out to Fortress Press for their support of this event by giving chapters to the participants and also awarding copies of the book. Now, having done that, I want to pick a bone with Fortress because I wrote a blurb for the book, and on the back cover, my blurb is severely condensed. And it reads on the back cover that I said, a rightly ordered Christian doctrine of Israel. Well, what I actually wrote was everyone who cares about a rightly ordered Christian doctrine of Israel will want to read and weigh this original and provocative book. And that's a judgment that I heartily endorse. This is a book worth reading. It is provocative. It sets out a position in clear and fresh terms. However, is it a rightly ordered doctrine of Israel from a Christian perspective? And I think the answer to that is no. I have a large substantial issues with many of the main lines of his argument. And I'll briefly set that out on 3 points. He frequently describes what he's doing as sketching a grammar, and I think that's an interesting metaphor. When we think of grammars can be descriptive or they can be prescriptive. A descriptive grammar, I take it, is one that tries to describe the way a language is actually spoken. A prescriptive grammar gives suggestions about how that language should be reformed. Paul Griffiths' book is a strongly prescriptive grammar. It doesn't actually correspond to the way in which Christians, or for that matter, scriptures, ordinarily use terms. And he himself recognizes that. My first problem and with that is that if we do adopt his grammar, a lot of what the New Testament scriptures say is ungrammatical. Paul Griffiths reserves the term Israelite for Christians, for the whole biblical tradition until the post-New Testament period. Not putting it another way, Jews and Christians don't emerge until the parting of the ways. So it's impossible using his grammar to talk about Jews in the New Testament. Salvation is not from the Jews. Jesus is not the king of the Jews. Paul is wrong to talk about his kinsmen after the flesh as Israelites in a way that draws a connection between the Israelites and the Jewish people. What's gone wrong? In my estimate, there's a lot of wonderful detail in the book, but early on, the book does go wrong. And Father Neuhaus has already drawn attention to this. It's the way in which he draws the distinction between Israel and the nations. And as Paul uses the terms, Israel denotes the community of the church and the synagogue that is close to God. The nations or Gentiles become, really in a very traditional Catholic or Christian way, the pagan masses outside the light of God. Now on page 12, he says this doesn't imply a wholly negative theology of the Gentiles. I think he's wrong. His way of constructing the terms indicates that Gentiles qua Gentiles, nations qua nations, are a wholly negative category. Perhaps if we conceive them as creatures or in some other respect, we can redo them. But as he says at several occasions in the book, to be drawn close to the God of Israel is to lose one's gentility, one's characteristic as belonging to the nations. Another way of talking about what's going on here is we have an extremely negative valuation of Gentile identity and an extremely high evaluation of Israelite identity from a Christian point of view, in which the Christian desire to claim the title Israel for ourselves is alive and very, very strong in this book. Of course, the church has long claimed to be Israel, but I would make this proposal about the historical circumstances of the two communities. The title Israel is a genuinely central and existentially central self-designation of the Jewish people, and has been for a very long time. When you think about Israel as a title of the church, I think we would have to say Israel is simply one of many self-designations the church has used for itself. It's not one that we find in Scripture as a designation of the church. It's not one that emerges especially early in the tradition. When it does emerge, it is closely tied to the tradition of supersessionism. So here we have the paradox of a strongly non-supersessionist book that is making a very profoundly traditional claim. We are Israel. So that's one criticism I have. Namely, you can't think through who the Israel is in an adequate way, in my view, without thinking through who the nations are. And in order to do that, you have to have a somewhat more appreciative evaluation of the nations in God's providence. A second criticism I have, and this is actually a criticism that emerged, concerns Paul's language of a complicating fugue. So everybody's an Israelite in the Bible, but because insofar as they're drawn at all to the God of Israel. But in the post-biblical context, we get a complicating fugue. And it's at that point that the church and the synagogue emerge and people becomes Christians and Jews for the first time. The first time I read the book, I was very drawn to the language of complicating fugue. It struck me as attractive, interesting, provocative, and I still think it's all those things. On a second reading, though, I have to say, I found the language a bit obscuring of the historical record, and language that makes it difficult to think clearly about some of the practical issues that led to the so-called parting of the ways. Third point, what would be an alternative and more fruitful way of thinking about the relationship of Israel and the nations as a starting point? Is it possible to think of the relationship in a way that does justice to the distinctive role of the Jewish people as Israel, while not wholly disqualifying the significance of the nations in God's economy? in an interesting way, I think Michael Wyshegrod does this very successfully over time. One of the early places where he does that is in a 1970 essay that appears in a book by John Osterreicher. Osterreicher was the principal author of Nostra Aetate 4. And in that book, the way Wyshegrod glosses the distinction of Israel and the nations is not in terms of loved and not loved, saved and not saved. He does use the term elect and not elect. But the point he makes about that is both elect and non-elect are both loved by God, loved in different ways. As I see it as a Christian, and not as a Roman Catholic, a United Methodist Christian, the distinctive character of the way in which the Jewish people relate to God is by means of a corporate calling that coincides with a natal community. Nations also relate to the God of Israel, but not by virtue of being called as natal communities. Individual Gentiles, members of the nations, are loved. The nations themselves are under God's guiding providence and wisdom, but they're not called as natal communities. That's not the difference between close and far, or loved and not loved. It's two different ways of being touched by the finger of God. And it's that proposal that I would put in place of Paul's valuations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That gives us a lot to think about when we take these four responses together. I do want to take just a moment for a quick announcement. We've had one question regarding recording. We are recording this session, and it will be made available publicly mid-June, as are other previous sessions organized by the Society. So please know that if you, as I am, are just sort of drinking from the fire hose here and trying to keep track, you will have the opportunity to rewatch in the future. In just a few moments, I want to open up our conversation to questions from those who are present. I can see some of those questions coming in now. I do want to offer a space of just a few moments if it is the case that any of our panelists want to take a moment now to respond to something you've heard, to ask a question of one of the other panelists. Is there anyone that would like to do that?
I would like to just say something briefly, make a comment, in particular in response to something that Daniel was saying, which is one of the characteristics of the book is there are no quotes, or there are no footnotes, and so it's difficult to tell what the main influences are on any particular text within the book. But he does at the end have a kind of bibliography of works consulted, which are meant to be, I think, more like the works really that he's recommending. They're not just like, general resources. And as I was looking through that, and also in reading the book, the main sources I was detecting for many of the binaries that he was constructing were not Christian sources that he was simply reversing, but it was actually Franz Rosenzweig, Michael Wyshegrod, and Daniel Boyarin, who all appear prominently within the works consulted. And the point there is, I don't think it's the case that Paul Griffiths was not actually listening to Jewish voices. He simply tries to accentuate that he's not claiming to be an authority in that sphere, and that he's not wanting to, that he doesn't feel like he or the church has standing to be able to speak to the quote unquote synagogue about its own internal way of conceiving of itself. But I think he was listening, and in fact, he was building upon some 20th century and 21st century ways, some at least Jewish thinkers have approached these matters. So I think I'll just leave it at that. I see Daniel's also got his hand up.
Daniel, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. No, I had thank you. Actually, I just had a couple things to respond, especially to some of the things Kendall said, but I think the point Mark raised is also, I just to say briefly that I was also going to mention, it sounds a lot like Rosenzweig throughout the book. Now, and what's interesting about that is I think there are some elements of this essentializing contrast between Jews and Christians that could be linked to earlier Christian theology. But I actually think Rosenzweig is another example who creates a essentializing contrast between Jews and Christians in a potentially problematic way. So, but you're right. I think it is helpful to point out that it may be the essentializing isn't only linked to Christian theology. There could be types of Jewish theology that also problematically essentialize. So I think it's relevant to look at. But the question I wanted to just raise in response to some of what Kendall said, because I do think for me, I didn't think the issue was that problematic about the notion of including the church under Israel alongside Jews. Insofar as I think it's an interesting question, has the main problem that people point out in questions of supersessionism been about the church using the label Israel for itself, or has it more been about the church denying the label Israel to Jews? And those are two separate, those could be related, but my sense is the problem has come more from the dynamics of denying the label Israel to Jews. And that doesn't seem to be something that Griffiths does. So that again, there could still be issues about, as Kendall raised, about the church, how it applies the term Israel to itself. But it's because I did think actually he didn't have a totally negative view of Gentiles or the nations. In fact, I also thought that at the first chapter, I was thinking the same way as Kendall raised, but then later on in the book, he does talk specifically about the notion of, he talks about on page 12, he said the question of the Gentiles' blessings lie almost entirely outside the scope of this book. And he says standard ways of attending to it could include God's covenant with Noah. And they said, but it's a good question deserving a good and full answer. So I think it's true that he doesn't address that in a substantial way, but I think he does at least point to in his account that he thinks his account of Israel can also go along with an account of God's blessings for Gentiles. And it's interesting in that regard with the Noahide covenant, it did seem like he was drawing on various things he might have drawn from reading Jewish or rabbinic writers. So I'd actually, in ways that might give a different type of construction than had previously been in a lot of Christian theology. So in some ways, actually, there might be ways in which he is actually informed by various elements of rabbinic or Jewish theology in interesting ways that at least would be worth taking into account. And again, that's a separate issue from the essentializing moves around that. But I think it's not necessarily the case that he's putting a wholly negative account of Gentiles, but just that's more absent from the book, which could be a criticism, but it's the absence doesn't necessarily mean negative per se, but or we could discuss it more.
Just briefly, I would say if it were an absence that could be filled in, I'd feel much better about it. The thing is that the basic grammar simply stipulates that the way to get close to God is to cease to be a Gentile and to become an Israelite. And so that is just baked in so deep that it basically means Gentiles don't have a future qua Gentile. They may have a future qua Israelite or qua creature, but not qua Gentile. So.
Yeah, and it's a question. I mean, I think he does. There are impulses in his book that go in that direction, but I think it seems like his overall account could at least be compatible with the notion that becoming an Israelite puts one in a different type of relation to God, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Gentiles are not in relation to God. Again, I think this would be where rabbinic theology comes in, because there are rabbinic theologies of saying that there's a distinction if a Gentile becomes an Israelite, but that the qua Gentiles also are already in covenantal relation with God through the Noahide covenant. And so that element of covenant, I think, is key. That there's the Sinai covenant, which is something different, but then the Noahide covenant is or at least can be construed in a robust notion of covenant, which I think is less prominent in Christian theology. It could be found in some places, but I think it seemed that Griffiths was, again, he doesn't say explicitly where he's getting it from, but it felt like some of that was from engagement with rabbinic theology in interesting ways. But we could discuss further.
I'm inclined to go ahead and turn to some questions from participants if the panelists are willing to entertain those. I see two at least possibilities, although our time is short. So what I'd like to do is to turn to one question that actually represents more than one, and it fits in well with some of the panelists' comments that we've heard already. Panelists have noted certain concerns about the binary that's presented in this book and the way that it functions. Jordan Blanchard asks specifically this: Griffiths refers to the church as farther from God since they face the Gentiles, while the synagogue faces God. And John Wright elsewhere notes this is, of course, the most fundamental way in which we seem to hear Rosenzweig at work. Is it fair to divide Israel's double vocation to love God and to love neighbor? The implication being that that is what this would do. And he notes further, Yeshua himself identifies with the least of these, which would imply that to face the Gentiles is to be close to God. How do you understand Griffiths' clean division of Israel's vocation between churches facing the Gentiles and synagogues facing God? Maybe we could just hear from one or two of our panelists on your thoughts on that particular characteristic of this division. I just see a physical hand or something.
I'll just
Kendall, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
I'll briefly say there is something that I would say is emotionally attractive about talking in terms of distance and closeness. But at the end of the day, I guess I don't find it that useful. And what I do think we can talk about are different ways. And I don't know that I'm happy with the idea that I'll leave it there. David, I saw your hand going up too.
So within the limitations of the metaphor regarding closeness, I think it might be helpful to separate closeness from better. I think that's kind of the danger. I found Mark's reference to religious congregation and laity, and at least where we're coming to now in the Catholic Church, not to consider religious better than lay, but different vocations. And again, I think it's helpful to consider the new interpretations given to Mary and Martha, which I think are very connected to that we always said Martha is better because she's staying there in that intimacy. But what are the call of God to the nations, as Jordan is pointing out, are to find Jesus there where Jesus is, or to find the God everywhere, is going out, away, in order to bring others in. I think, again, that the two vocations are one perhaps in the limited metaphor to be close and the other a little further, but it's not a case of the one is better than the other.
Could I come in? Is it? Yeah, I
Yes.
think this part about this, the church facing the Gentiles and the synagogue facing God, that also sounds a lot like he's taking it from Rosenzweig. And again, there could be other sources. And I think, again, Rosenzweig especially presents the church in Rosenzweig's terms as linked, especially when he said the Gentiles, but if you translate instead of as Gentiles, as nations, which I think actually points to some of the political dimensions, which Griffiths gets at as well, but especially Rosenzweig points to. he sees especially the church is bound to merging with the state and participating in the life of nation states. And Rosenzweig portrays in the synagogue as not engaging in that role of merging with states, which Rosenzweig links to shedding blood. He sees the church participates in shedding blood, and the synagogue doesn't participate in shedding blood in terms of merging with these nation states. And I think, again, this is Rosenzweig's essentializing division. And I think it would be complicated if you look at, again, the aspect, it depends which church you're talking about. If you look at, say, Anabaptist churches, you could talk about some elements of quite similar to some rabbinic theology of resisting a merging with the state, would then not be the same thing. That type of church might not be facing the nations in the same way. By facing, meaning, I think Griffith means participating with, and merging with. And so I think that this question of which group is facing God or facing the nations would depend on which particular times and places you're looking in. And again, I think there is something useful in talking about a group or a community at a certain point that could be described more as facing God versus facing the nations. But again, to associate it simply with the church does this one thing and the synagogue does the other, again, is to me seems less helpful. But yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just make a comment?
Okay.
Sorry. I just want to make a comment on what Daniel is insisting on, and that is historical specificity. I think that you're reminding us, Daniel, either knowingly or not, that at Vatican II, there was a very definite move away from theology that is completely speculative, that is really categories interacting with one another. And there was the call to enter into history and especially sociology and anthropology. And I think that in that sense, reading the Griffiths book is a little bit like reading classical Catholic theological texts that do not engage with what you're obliging us to engage with, and that is the detail that makes simplicity a lot more difficult to attain, but makes, of course, the theology a lot more real and anthropological.
Just another short comment. I didn't really, in my own response to the book, express any of what my own thoughts might be on this question of the proximity. My concern was, as I was clear, was specifically to show or to argue that it is possible to construct forms of post-supersessionist Christian theology that are not soft supersessionist. In reality, I have reservations about some of the ways that Paul put this together in terms of the nearness and greater holiness. I think it needs a lot of qualification, I guess I do think, as much as I'm concerned about the historical specificity and the issues of diversity and concerns about essentializing, I mean, I do think there are these different emphases in the traditional halachic Jewish way of life and the traditional Christian approaches to things, where there really are these different emphases and outlines. And my concern sometimes in our desire to avoid essentializing, we refuse to notice these rough outlines that really are distinctions. And I think some of the things that Paul Griffiths is pointing out really are identifying some things that are truly there. For example, that make the church uniquely capable to be able to enter into various cultures and preserve its own identity and have a degree of flexibility that makes it has great potential for effectiveness in, as he calls it, liturgical recruitment, whereas that's not at never been at the heart of of Jewish life in the same sense. So I just wouldn't want to lose that in the midst of the reservations which I share.
Let me turn, if it's okay, to a second audience question that has just come in, but I think it's very closely related to these essential questions. Therese Gottstein asks, is this idea of closeness to God in the book, which I, Therese says, have not read, but related to the priestly vocation of the Jewish people? This would give more the idea of a closeness related to service in view of the nations, a closeness like the priests in the temple. Any thoughts? Mark Kinzer likes
Yeah.
it. He's
Yes.
nodding.
I would have actually liked to seen Paul Griffiths develop that a bit, because he's using the notion of holiness, and there, like within what he calls Israel's archive, namely the biblical record, we have this internal distinction in the midst of the tribes of Israel, with the Kohanim, the priests as set apart and having a different type of holiness that exists for the sake of the people of Israel, who as a whole are also an Am Kadosh, a holy people. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more development of that, because you very much have that sense that the Kohanim exist for the sake of the people as a whole. That could have been I think that could have been a fruitful direction for him to take. In some ways, that way I was trying to gesture towards that a little bit with the image of the religious order and laity. You could have talked about priesthood and laity in terms of the Catholic traditions.
Yeah, just to build on that, I actually did think Griffiths did do interesting things with notions of holiness, and there could be notions of holiness that are types of difference that is not about better or worse. In the biblical text, the sort of priestly and lay, or the priestly tribe and the other tribes, it's the priest could have a different vocation that's not about being better or worse than the others. And so I think Griffiths does do interesting things in drawing on those themes of holiness in that way. So in response to Teresa's question, but again, I think it's it's interesting, especially in the first few centuries, say prior to the 4th century. So there are a lot of Christian writers who are drawing on biblical tropes of the Levites and holiness to describe the Christian role of the role of Christians as the priestly group vis-a-vis in the pagan Roman Empire. The Christians are the priestly group who's mediating God to the as the pagans, as it were, as laity in that way. So that is itself an interesting drawing on that trope. And so it's I think maybe this is a place where actually engaging with historical specificity in different times and places could reinforce some of the intuitions that I think Griffiths is drawing on in those ways. So yeah, I think that part is the notion of priestliness as related to closeness of God is one interesting direction that it could go
in. Let me pose a little more provocative question that certainly comes from the perspective of a traditional ecclesial categories, and takes account of the fact that is presumably the position from which Griffiths himself writes as well. The question is, again, related to this idea of closeness, but asking about the crucial practice in the church of the consumption of Eucharist. Ross McCullough puts it very succinctly on the propinquity of the synagogue because of its more fleshly connection. What about the Eucharist? Now, of course, it's a tricky question because this will surface some differences between different Christian traditions. But again, I think one possibility here is to address Griffiths on his own terms, which would be Catholic terms, presumably. I'm open to any thoughts, but I don't know, Father David, you may have specific thoughts about this, but maybe others do as well. And of course, the views vary widely. So there's,
So
but it's fleshly.
I think it's important to point out that Griffiths addresses that very, very specifically. So I think that really one can read the pages in the book where he talks about the Eucharist. But I think, again, it's very, very interesting. And I think that he's attempting to be and succeeding to be provocative because of our absolute certitude that by consuming the flesh of Christ, we are being cleaved to Christ. Whereas he wants to point out that Jews, by their very nature, are cloven to Christ. So again, it's a real challenging discourse to unsettle. And I think that that's positive, so that we really think about these issues a lot deeper than we have.
Kendall, did you want to go ahead?
Are we still on the same question, Holly?
You'd like to add your voice to that? Yes.
Yes, I think the Eucharist, I think, is a good example of how it's hard to draw and sustain a crisp distinction between Christianity and Judaism around this, using the language of proximity. But I do think there is a place where the traditions actually are crisply different. And oddly, and he makes something of this, but I think he could have made more of it. And that is that there are two ways of becoming a Jew. You can be born a Jew or you can convert to Judaism. There's only one way to become a Christian. Nobody can possibly be born a Christian. Okay. That is a bright line difference. And now you can obscure the difference, so psychologically, sociologically, etc., but you can't, theologically, you can't get rid of it. And it seems to me that that is a way of teasing, that would be another way of teasing out which one of those two is closer to God. Well, who can tell? Each in its own way, but they have different logics to them.
If I could I come in on that as well? That I think that is a good example. I had that in my notes as well to bring up, because I think it's an interesting example where definitely you could say from, I don't know, a certain time period onward, maybe 4th, 5th century, that becomes a prominent element in Christian theology, and construed in Christian theology as differentiating it from Judaism, and also within rabbinic theology, as you've said, there can be two ways of being part of Israel from the rabbinic perspective. One would be through elements of birth, and the other would be by conversion. But I actually think this is where the question of history comes in. I've published an article looking at this, that actually it seems potentially in the first few centuries of Christian tradition, say prior to the 4th century, that wasn't necessarily such a sharp difference. That especially in the New Testament texts themselves, and then also even through those next few centuries, it wasn't highlighted that this is the essential difference. And it may be the case that in a lot of those Christian communities, including more mainstream ones during that, whatever that would mean, not that there was a mainstream at that time per se, but that across the board there seems to have been a notion of those who are born to parents already within the Christian community would potentially be themselves already then part of God's people, without the need for baptism. And so the time period when we start to see a different emphasis of saying, no, all people born to Christian parents themselves need to be baptized, from the 4th century onwards, especially like Augustine as one key point, that does become a sharp difference between Judaism and Christianity in that time context. But that's also a context where there's a strong effort within these Christian theological themes of wanting to assert a sharp difference also in other regards between Judaism and Christianity about flesh and spirit, this being one of them. And I think it is so important to take into account, as Mark previously said, and as Kendall saying, that you do get a different emphasis within the traditions, and especially in certain time periods onward. But even with this example, I don't know if I would call it a bright line. If you look, there would still be, especially in the earlier time period, and then even at various points throughout later centuries, you can see pieces here and there. So I agree, it could be interesting to think about that. You could say a strong difference in emphasis, especially amongst Jews today and Christians today, or people who call themselves that in different ways. But whether to treat it as a bright line, essentially, or even theologically, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Are there in which theological context has it been asserted that one cannot be a Christian or part of the body of Christ by birth? There's various theological writers saying that, but is it, I don't know, did different councils assert that or not? It's become sort of an assumption, but I think if we look at some earlier writings, it may not be the case. So and that was what, again, it fits with Griffiths essentializing, but which may be more, that type of essentializing may be more widespread, but I don't think there would be interesting questions to raise. Also, even with regard to that one, I don't know, others may disagree.
Okay, I am seeing a follow-up question that I would like to turn to from Gavin DaCosta, who's thought carefully about these things, from whom many of us have learned a lot. On this question of empirical Jews and theologically constructed Jews, the hypothetical Jews, rhetorical Jews. And specifically, he's posing the question in response to David Neuhaus in this way. Can Christians really get away from the category of theologically constructed Jews, particularly if they are relying on Paul's discussion in Romans 9 through 11? Just a little bit of background, that is a text from Paul that has gotten a great deal of attention. It suggests in not perfectly clear ways, but the Jews will be gathered in to a larger salvation history that has now come to include the Gentiles. Now I'm realizing what a mistake it was to try to briefly summarize Romans 9 through 11. It's Gavin DaCosta's fault. You see the question, though. You see the question. Does Romans 9 through 11 give us a theologically constructed category of Jews that has to play some role for Christians? And then also to Daniel Weiss, Gavin asks, how determinative, it's a great question, how determinative should Jewish voices be for Catholic theological constructs? Can they render a judgment, for example, in Romans 9 through 11? So any thoughts about that?
I'm not quite 100% sure why Gavin addressed that question to me specifically, but I'll give an answer. I think that Roman Catholic theology cannot get away from tradition, which of course includes a very important meditation, reflection, drawing from scripture. That is absolutely one pole. But I think that we are obligated to look at the fruits of that reflection over centuries of history and therefore bring in the real Jew into our dialogue and do theology with, again, there's been a big debate here, to what extent is Griffiths doing theology with Jewish voices because of the voices that he mentions, Boyarin, Rosenzweig, etc., etc. I think that this has become an essential part of doing theology right now. Again, I think I identify this as one of the enormous changes at Vatican II and post-Vatican II, and that is in our engagement with the world, we are obligated to do theology differently. That is not to abandon all the important thematics that we've been dealing with for centuries, but now we are called to a reckoning with the fruits of that theological discourse. And I think it's out of this that is born Griffiths' work. But I must say that I do find it lacking because of what Daniel has already pointed out, and that is to what extent, and I think that Mark has pointed out to some extent, but the question remains, to what extent is he really engaging with real living Jews in this search for a language that can say synagogue from within the church?
Yeah, if I may, I want to go on the record expressing appreciation for Paul Griffiths' book for doing constructive normative theology with that he says this is a sketch, it's a grammar, it's not exhaustive, it's not encyclopedic, it doesn't make pretensions or claims of that sort. And I think it has value for that reason. I think it can also be justly faulted and is vulnerable for the reasons that we're identifying. But I think that Gavin's question is an important one, because at the end of the day, theology is not about simply piling up descriptive accounts of what other people have said in other historical time periods. It's an attempt to say, how should we talk now? And as soon as you move into that normative register, you are going to be engaging in making, claims that look essential about what things really are, because that's the kind of witness that we're called to provide, So I on those grounds, I'd be inclined to express appreciation for Paul's book.
If I could come and say, echoing what the previous two people have said, I think if I was emphasizing the importance of looking at empirical, say Jews and history in that regard, that wasn't to mean that that should be the only factor. One can look at, say elements in Christian theological instruction, say scripture, tradition, reason, experience. That may be more Methodist, but I think also in Catholic theology. So it's not even about if Gavin DeCosta is asking how determinative should Jewish voices be. My concern was not about how determinative they should be in terms of the percentage, et cetera, but that there should be the role that should play a role. And it could be up to then an individual theologian to figure out how to combine those elements of looking at scripture, looking at Romans 9 through 11, looking at tradition, then looking at, I guess this would fall in the role of maybe reason then experience, especially say experience points to empirical Jews, empirical history. David pointed out aspects of sociology, these other methodologies. And I think on any given question, you could figure out what the particular theologian can figure out what the balance should be, what role, how much should play. But I do think, though, in saying this question of Christian theology about Jews, because that might be slightly different than Christian theology about some other Christian theological topics. In the aspect of Christian theology about Jews, where one can say there's been historically an absence of engaging with empirical Jews and Jewish voices. One might think in that context there could be a greater significance of at least asking about what Jews might say or think. I think that's not necessarily about the determinativeness, but that's showing that that's somehow taken into account, and then the author can give their own theological judgment about how significant that should be. And I think the issue with the Paul Griffiths book is that it's the way it comes across, at least, that may not be the intention, is that it really seems to be an account that doesn't take that into account at all in the presentation or in the stated methodology. So it's not about how much it would need to take into account, but at least somewhat, and then the degree of the sum could be left to be determined.
I'm going to go ahead and give Daniel the last word. I want to say thank you again to all four of our panelists. Please imagine right now thunderous in-person applause, because I know that I'm not the only one that has been grateful for the work that you're doing. Whenever we do a panel like this, each of the scholars speaking actually brings years of work, and offers them to us. So thank you for that. And I want to say, I'll offer a very quick reminder, just housekeeping, that you'll see here in the chat for this conversation information again about free books that are waiting to be sent out to our winners. So look at those details there. And maybe just conclude by repeating something that Kendall said. You know, it's interesting, our conversation has focused on maybe sort of the beauty of different roles and how those roles can be put to the service of larger community. And I think we can agree that Paul Griffiths has a certain gift for making bold claims and offering them to the community. And that's a very particular and important gift. So thank you to him for inspiring this conversation. And thank you to panelists and to participants too for your careful engagement. We'll wrap it up there, and we will hope to see all of you again, whether virtually or in person, hoping that you can continue to connect with the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology and our work in conversation with you. Good afternoon from the East Coast and in your time zone as well to all. Bye-bye.